Welcome to this episode of the People Dividend podcast. I'm your host, Mike Horne, and I am delighted to be in the virtual studio today with Craig Mattson. And Craig is perhaps a little bit different than many of our other guests, and yet similar in so many other ways in that he's interested in organizations. But he's an organizational researcher, an author, a professor, who's recently published a book called Digital Overwhelm. And he's done lots of research on the disconnection and intensity that many American workers feel in their organizational community. So that'll be a topic that plays right into the People Dividend and what it means when you feel isolated or discarded or abandoned at work. And so I'm so glad to, again, talk with Craig. We're going to cover a lot of issues and topics on what it means to be in the American workplace today for every generation. So, Craig, welcome, and why don't you say a little bit about yourself?
Thank you for inviting me into your space, Mike. This is an honor to be here, and it's great to chat with your audience. I think of the workplace as a sort of under-examined space in American life. Like the media often draws our attention to political spaces or to other kinds of cultural spaces, but the workplace is, it's such an important part of our lives. And so if we could do that better, that's one of my passions. So I'm glad that there are podcasts like the People Dividend, and I'm really grateful to be here. I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which right now is a little gray, a little cold, and I'm sort of envious of people who live in other parts of the country where the sun shines more often.
That's great. And when you think about the workplace today, Craig, I mean, how do we define the workplace? I mean, part of the reason I wrote the People Dividend was because one is the sense of isolation people feel at work, but secondly, because of the advance of the gig economy, many people don't understand organizations in the way that people who grew up in the era of men and women of the corporation, to think about Rosa Moss Cantor's book of ancient lore. And people also have variable work locations. I mean, it's such a standard in many places. And we have the erosion of middle management. I mean, that's brought about for lots of different reasons. But how does all this fit into your world about workplaces and why you're concerned and interested about them?
Yeah, I appreciate the question about what is the workplace today. It's a somewhat blurrily defined space in our lives. It's important, but where is it exactly? I think workplaces require us today to think about modes, which is a frequently used term in my book, Digital Overwhelm. We have to think not always about physical spaces, but about modes of relationship, modes of engagement. And so thinking about that requires a bit more flexibility than maybe we've had to practice in past discussions about the workplace. I remember my first set of jobs. There was very definitely a bricks and mortar place I went to, and that was the home base for that construction company I worked in college. And then my job out of college was a radio station, and that also was a very boundaried space. There was a studio, and you slid the glass door open and walked into that studio, and you knew where you were. But today, we have to think about different modes of work. We have to think about different ways that we relate to our coworkers and to our managers and to each other. So, I think it's a slippery concept. It's a blurry concept sometimes, but the return to office mandates, the discussions about hybrid work arrangements, and what kind of benefits we're willing to negotiate, both as people seeking jobs or as people holding jobs and managing jobs. That's a huge conversation today.
And Craig, did that in part contribute to the digital overwhelm, or talk about the origin story there?
Yes, I think so. I think you put your finger on it. In 2022, I started talking with rising professionals because, my sense is that they're some of the more precarious and also attentive participants in the workplace today. So I was talking with people that are sometimes referred to as like quarter lifers, people from 20 to 40. And I was asking them, like, how are you dealing with all kinds of pressure in the workplace? It was the early 2020s, of course, and there was a very palpable sense that things were changing. Society was in upheaval. We were in a pandemic, and so it wasn't hard to find those pressures. As I talked with them, as I gathered stories, as I took a lot of notes, I began to think, geez, I think the way we need to synopsize this is in terms of an intersection between, on the one hand, technological development, and on the other hand, a greater willingness to be emotionally present in the workplace. Put those two things together, and I think you get digital overwhelm.
And so look, a lot of people experience digital overwhelm, I'm sure. And what does that mean practically in the workplace? I mean, what are some of the implications for employees and managers?
I think it means that we have a multiplication, a proliferation of platforms and devices. And keeping track of those, on the one hand, is sort of exciting and energizing. Wow, this platform enables us to make all kinds of connections. I mean, you and I connected on a digital platform initially, and I was excited to meet you and to hear about your podcast and your work. So that can be very animating and caffeinating even. But on the other hand, we have to keep track of a lot of passwords and software updates and notifications. And how did I connect with that colleague? Was that on text, or was it DM, or was it on Slack, or is it lost in my Outlook email folder? Like, how the heck? So I think that's practically what it means, is that a lot of the time we find ourselves feeling like, I can't get my footing in this work because I'm trying to keep track of all my platforms. How's that sound to you?
Yeah, that's great. And how do we bring the values of in-person communication to digital spaces?
Well, initially, I was inclined to say the values that we practice in face-to-face communication, we have to figure out how to translate them into digital spaces. That's how I started. So I thought about that in terms of like speech, like how do you talk to somebody, and then how do you bring that into a digital space? I still think that's a pretty good idea, but I think we need more good ideas. And so I started to think about what I call the concept of modes of communication. And I came to think of them as like ways of coping. That sounds strange because communication is a way to transfer information, right? But it's also a way to manage relationships and build community. And I think it's also a way that we frequently use to cope with stress and pressure. And so I identified 6 modes of communication that I heard a lot of people talking about. And these would be things like, I tried to use sort of colloquial language for this. I would talk about emailing things as a mode of coping with the pressures. I'm going to write a big fat email here and get us all on one page. That's one way we cope. Or another would be, we need to have a face-to-face conversation. Let's get on Zoom, or let's meet in person at a coffee shop and let's talk this thing out. Other people were more like less is more kind of communicators. They're like, all we need is a quick text exchange. We should be able to figure this out. And so on and so forth. So that's how I thought people were dealing with digital overwhelm. And I'll sort of stop there and see what that's making you think.
Well, it makes me think about, I mean, personally, how do I deal with email overwhelm? Do I have to respond to every email same day?
Check the 10 commandments of email. Let's see. I'm really reluctant to give rules here. I think that my book tries to discuss the relational dynamics that open up when we get an email, or when we have 450 emails in our inbox. And those are variable dynamics. Like, what does it mean to be a emotionally intelligent, relationally responsive human being in our inboxes? I think that's hard. And I think that yeah, I think we're tempted to sort of become sort of machine-like in our responses. Maybe delegate this to AI. Um, so my recommendation was not so much a rule, like you got to reply within 48 hours. I do appreciate people who are responsive by email, but I think that my response was more to set a goal for people. And that is, how often can I manage to be, uh, you know, present to another person in an email? And so in my book, I talk about that in terms of like thinking about the voice of your emails. So that requires slowing down a bit. And that might mean slowing down your response time a bit. And I think this is probably impractical for every email, but as often as you can you think about how your email sounds in terms of volume? Is it super loud? Or is it maybe too quiet, too bland to be even noticed? Could you think about the pitch of your emails as you do when you speak? Can you think about the rate of your emails? What kind of cadence does the communication have? So I guess suggesting that sort of voice metaphor was one way of thinking about how do I be present to other people, even in the kind of impersonal exchanges that sometimes happen in email.
Well, that's so great because you can think about presence in so many different ways.
Hmm.
And I love extending that concept of thinking about email, which to me seems so stuffy and formal. And I always feel certain pressure relative to an email response versus a text response versus some other kind of response. And yet,
Yeah.
all demand some sort of urgency or Slack or any of the other
Mm-hmm.
channels that we're on, Teams.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, any of these that clients and my teams
Mm-hmm.
use alike. So as you think about this and you think about digital overwhelm, what happens if your job doesn't feel meaningful? Should you just
Mm-hmm.
quit or?
Yeah, I that was sort of a surprise to me in my research. I'm a Gen Xer. I think there are some generational assumptions that that go with being in my demographic. And one of them is just like your work's your work. It's your job. It's you just do it. Like whatever's put in front of you, keep your head down, get it done. And as I talked with people in this sort of quarter life category, yeah, I heard quite a different story about work. There were different postures towards work, and I really learned from that. I appreciated the postures. So, for instance, I found people who were quite skeptical about their jobs. They were like, "I don't think this means anything. Like, it's something I do to pay the bills, but I don't expect it to provide me with cosmic significance." I met quite a few people like that. And then I met people who were relatively disempowered in their workplace, and so they had to pretend like their job was meaningful, and that some kind of masking was necessary for them. They had to appear chipper and friendly and all that. Um, but I also met people. I mean, people are wildly diverse, right, in their relationships to work, who really saw their job as a way to care for others. Like this job maybe doesn't have any ultimate significance in the universe, but I'm here for my team. Like, how can I make sure my team's okay? Um, and then, yeah, I also met people who thought, no, my job is going to make a difference. Like, and if it's not, I'm going to find a different job. So the answer to your question is not a binary, right? It's not this or that. It's not quit or stay. It's really, how are you going to posture yourself towards your work? And that, I think, offers some flexibility. If you can actually think about your physical posture, like there are all kinds of ways that you can stand in relation to something. And maybe your posture changes throughout the day. Um, I'm not saying that there aren't times when you do need to quit your job. Like that's clearly the case, and people have been exploring those options through the Great Resignation of the early 2020s. And I'm really glad that people are rethinking their vocational stance. Um, but yeah, I think that the conversation about whether to quit or stay probably needs to open up into like multiple postures towards our work.
So great a way of thinking about that. And how do you persuade people at work to do their thing so that you can do your thing?
Yes, bringing up advocacy. That was another sort of surprise for me in the book, was just like what a lot of persuasive work people have to do. I remember talking with a guy who worked at a very large video game company, and Yeah, I mean, you're dealing with hundreds of people, and one person could slow that whole process down pretty significantly. So how do you, sort of support that person, but also maybe challenge them to get their work done so we can get this product out on the deadline? Um, I found that there were generally, again, multiple ways we needed to think about persuasion. For some people, the most important persuasive work they were doing in the workplace was internal. They had to persuade themselves that their voice mattered, that their ideas were important, and that, yeah, that they had worth and value and dignity. And sometimes that's a hard job in itself. Other
Well,
people found it. Oh yeah, go
no,
ahead.
no, no, please go ahead. Continue.
I'm just going to mention two other ways that persuasion also happened. I mean, people also felt like they needed to persuade their coworkers,
Uh,
and that was a kind of challenging sort of persuasion. And then for some people, the hardest work was persuading upward, like trying to convince a manager or a company owner that, like, no, this isn't a good idea. We need to try something else.
we've got such great and sage advice on looking for practical advice that all of us need for thriving in this tech-heavy world. But so it really brings me to this topic of indirect communication, Craig Mattson.
Mm,
And as you think
mm,
about it, what role should indirect communication play in
mhm.
everyday work and life?
Thank you for bringing that up. I think that was one of the sort of core themes for me in the book. We often think about communication in very direct ways. How am I going to get this in front of my audience? How am I going to get this to that target? We use the language of target a lot in our communication. But so much of human interaction happens at that sort of indirect, almost unspoken level. And I think that there's not enough reflection on that aspect of workplace life. But that indirect communication, it's a huge percentage of what's happening in a workplace. So learning to pay attention to what's being said in a kind of subtle or sideways or indicative fashion, man, that's huge. That's really huge. I could
And
give you some examples, but yeah, what does that make you think?
well, that makes me think about all of us need these guides to coping at work. And I
Mm,
think what digital overwhelm, and in the subtitle, it's a mid-career guide to coping at work. How about if
mhm,
we, move from coping to some other kind of dimension?
mhm.
What would you offer there? What would you think?
Yeah, that's an astute question. Somebody said, "What's the next book about?" It probably should be about something besides coping. And I think my goal would be something like a term I'm hearing a lot in HR discourse today: well-being. How can we move from just coping, just getting by, to people who are flourishing, people who are enjoying a kind of well-being at work? So I think all of the communicational advice in my book about navigating digital spaces and digital tools um, could be useful for that. And so, yeah, I'm hopeful to do some more thinking about not just coping, but flourishing.
Well, it's so great because we need well-being in so many different, or in a few categories in life: financial well-being,
Mm,
mental health well-being, emotional
hmm
well-being, physical well-being. It really
hmm
comes into so many places. And as you think about the digital overwhelm, Craig Mattson,
hmm
um,
hmm
eh, how do you take this from your professional life into your personal life?
mm, yeah. Well, one of the, I don't know, curiosities to me in this research was how many people were doing that. They wanted to talk about their personal lives. And I think it was somewhat because, remote work, hybrid work is compelling us to rethink what does this look like when I'm doing this work at my kitchen table or in the office upstairs looking out over my backyard. What's personal? What's professional? Those are questions we're having to give more time to. But as we take it into personal life, I think it's let me think about that. I think it's interesting to uh, reflect on these modes of communication as ways that we might interact with spouses or partners, ways that we might interact with children. I remember talking with someone who said, it seems like your book might span the challenge of millennial parents who might have almost Gen Z children, and the millennial parents are feeling distracted and like their attention is drawn in multiple directions, but they're also concerned about their smartphone addicted kids. So yeah, I do think that the ways that this book talks about modes of communication is translatable into our interactions in our more private lives.
Well, it's so great, Craig, that you've been able to bring all of this research and bring it to bear in your book, Digital Overwhelm. And as if you were going to offer one piece of guidance to our HR leaders listening today, and so one piece of advice, how do people continue a conversation with you? We'll have it in the show notes too, but why don't you mention that?
Sure. The book is divided into, sort of substantial chapters discussing each mode of communication, but there's a half chapter that follows each one. That's I call it a mode switch workshop. And my website is called The Mode Switch, all one word.com, themodeswitch.com. A last piece of advice for HR managers, I think a lot of the advice that I'm seeing out there for managing digital overwhelm centers on eliminating technology, simplifying technology. It's sometimes referred to as digital minimalism. And I think there's a lot of wisdom there. But I think the advice of my book is more along the lines of digital flexibility, always asking ourselves, how does this digital tool or digital platform interact with the actual context of my workers? How might I need to change this up? I don't know if it means simplifying it necessarily, but I do think it often means switching things up, trying, being experimental, being a little provisional, and trying to cultivate digital flexibility.
Well, that's so great to think about that. And Craig, it's been great having you on the People Dividend podcast. Great to hear about your work and your research that resulted in digital overwhelm. And again, thanks so much for all of the insights on what it means to cope with this digital overwhelm. And hopefully we move to how we thrive with it all and move forward into the future. So thank you again, Craig. And until the next episode of the People Dividend, stay well.